going to go ahead and begin, even though everyone has not yet quite returned to their seat. Fred told me that I needed to maybe make a few extra remarks to explain what I meant by this topic. He did not tell me that I had to move up to the other end of the table. Here I am. As always, want to begin with reference to the U.S. Constitution, because that was fundamental to me long ago, early in my career, because I thought everything derived from all of our freedoms, our economic system, everything depended on what James Madison had written in our Constitution, trying to design a system of democracy, freedom, and markets. But then along the way, not much later, I learned that that couldn't be right, because in the middle 1800s, Argentina had translated the U.S. Constitution word for word into Spanish, adopted it, and it still did not work. So it couldn't be that the language of the Constitution alone, the recipe, the rules, was sufficient. I later, not much longer later I suppose, learned that the Soviet Constitution, in many ways, was superior to the U.S. Constitution. In the list of rights, I think there were about 150 of them listed, something like that, and the protections of property and all sorts of things. And as Fred pointed out this morning, there are certain things in the Chinese Constitution, and you have to remember. I thought about these things when Rob Luders was chairing the draft committee to draft the Constitution for Chile, and how difficult it was to create something of rules to live by. And in the U.S. context, it was supposed to be, more or less was, that it was the people writing a series of rules for the government to live by, as opposed to the government writing a series of rules for the people to live by, as is the case in Europe. Thanks to one of our panelists today, Hugo, a quote from the Bible, Luke 8, we find the parable. A farmer went out to sow seeds for harvest. As he scattered his seeds, some of them fell on the hard pathway and were quickly trampled down and unable to grow and become nothing but bird seed. Some fell on the gravel, and though they sprouted, they couldn't take root. It withered for lack of moisture. Other seeds fell where there was nothing but weeds. They too were unable to grow to full maturity, for the weeds choked them out. Yet some of the seeds fell onto good, fertile soil, and they grew and flourished until they produced more than 100-fold harvest, a bumper crop. Our panel today is with 5 scholars from different countries in Latin America. They will address the question of whether the cultural characteristics and institutional arrangements exist which would provide a fertile soil for a market economy to take root, flourish, and endure. I had once read an interesting piece by George Schultz talking about what it meant to be an economic policy advisor in Washington to the government. And he said, our job is like the job of a gardener. It is to, and maybe George has read the Luke parable, to deal with the pests, to make sure that the soil is fertile and moist, and let the nature take its course from there. Quite different than being an architect, a bridge builder, or something else that a lot of economists think that their job is as a member of the government. In Hayek's view, the rules of human conduct that gradually evolved, especially those dealing with property, honesty, contract, exchange, trade, competition, and privacy, were essential. Fertile soil. Of course, Hayek was building on the principles set forth by Adam Smith, quote, "The property which every man has is his own labor, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable." I can't say that properly. So, to our panel, beginning with Rolf Luters.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I will be talking about this general topic in the context of the Chilean case. And what I will highlight is the importance of economic policies. You see, in your remarks, you sort of highlighted the importance of culture. And what I want to show is that within the same culture, you can have completely different outcomes depending on the economic policies you apply. And my final conclusion is that there is this inverse relationship between income inequality and stability of the system. Income inequality does make a difference. There's a famous, in Chile at least, famous documental about the Chicago boys in which they interviewed the two, and they said in that interview that the journalist asked me, what about income distribution? And I said, income distribution doesn't matter, it's just a matter of envy. It's just a matter of envy. Well, so that's what I believe. But if you look at the data, it does make a big difference in terms of the economic policies which are going to be adopted in terms of the stability of the system. So I think that we should be concerned about it, even if we think it doesn't matter. Okay. I want to first, well, in the case of Chile, and most of you know this, Chile is a country in which, in general, and over the last 200 years, rule of law has prevailed, property rights are relatively well protected, let's say. We have had a period in the 20th century of fiscal and monetary instability, but in general too, we have had relatively good macroeconomic policies, especially lately. There's open trade policies. In Chile, just like in Estonia, we unilaterally moved towards free trade, completely free trade. The average tariff in Chile today is 0.6%. Nothing. The maximum tariff is 6%. So it's a very open country. And we have had sensible regulations in general. So the basic institutions, which underpin the economic system, I think, it's a Catholic economic system, have been prevailing in the case of Chile. Now, the description of the Chilean case, well, recently, in the last, 50 years, sounds very much like the Estonian case. While I was listening to you, I thought, well, this is Chile. This is exactly Chile. And nevertheless, today in Chile, we have a problem. And we will talk about that. I have a description there, a graph on the first one on the left side, which is the story of the GDP of Chile in relationship to the one of the USA over the last 200 years. So it's the GDP of Chile in relationship to that one of the USA over the last 200 years. And what you can see is that between, let's say, 1830, when we finished our independence process. And well, 1912 actually, in that century, we grew faster than the United States. In the next period, the one between 1912 and 1983, we grew much slower than the United States. And then again, after 1983, well, we have been growing much faster than the United States, except during the last 10 years. Except during the last 10 years. But before that, yes, so we had this tremendous prosperity between 73 and 83 and 2010 or something, which really did extremely well. Now the interesting thing is that this is econometrically significant, let's say. What I prepared the graph and then applied discriminant analysis. I don't know if people are familiar with that here, because it's used in the biological sciences to distinguish between species. And so we had a species which described the Latin American economies, let's say in this case the USA economy, and we compared Chile with that species. And what we found then is that these differences are significant. We grew faster in the 19th century, slower in the 20th century, and again faster later on. Now, to do this analysis, you have to use other variables to control, and one is trade, and the other one is inflation. And if you do that, well, then you can explain why we grew faster in the 19th century, because we had an open economy and a free market economy. And the same thing is true starting in 1983. In the last period, we had an open economy and a free market economy, and fiscal responsibility and so on. Whereas in the 20th century, we did very badly because we had the wrong kinds of trade policies and the wrong kinds of macroeconomic policies. So there is this relationship between economic policy and growth. Now, well, the question then is, why did we stop growing faster than the USA in 1912? And I'm not going to go into that. It's the consequences of a war we had with Peru and Bolivia, which we gained the territory in that period of time, but we lost out. The Pacific War ended up being, the long, let's say, the consequences of the Pacific War were quite different from the ones most people think about. It actually did harm us a lot, I think. But the data at least suggests that. But the next question is, why did we shift from a declining relationship with the USA to one in which we grow faster than the USA in 1983, and that has to do with the fact that the governments which run the economy before 1973 did a really bad job. Well, there it is. And so people said, well, let's change and invite the military with the military coup, and then the Chicago Boys came in and the economy started to grow. The next question is what's happening now in the last few years. And there are many explanations. Sebastian Edwards, in a book he just wrote recently about the Chile project, it's a Chicago Boys project. He explains it because there are uneven income distribution, because of low pensions, and because of crony capitalism, whatever name you put on it. Well, there are other people, which which most of you know, who would argue that the problem is that we have not told the story, well enough. The left has told the story much better, their story was better, and therefore we have this instability in the regime. What I have a different explanation as the immediate cause, and I think the immediate cause was one of the difference between expectations of prosperity on the part of people and reality which did not take place. You see, our economy stopped growing for reasons which we can talk later in 2010. But people expected incomes to continue to grow at the rate we were growing, so they got very indebted. They consumed much more than what was possible. They got very indebted, and they erected and said, well, let's change the system. Now the question then is, why did we stop growing in 2010? And I think that has a lot to do with income distribution. Governments started to spend, to tax, let's say, business, and that is the main reason why we stopped growing after 2010, but we can discuss that later. So, if you look what's happening now immediately, as a consequence of this social outburst we had, we decided to write a new constitution. You all know about that for sure. And the first effort to write it in this new constitution was defeated and quite significantly, let's say. About 62% of the people rejected that first draft, and so that we went to write the second draft. The second draft is ready now. It's very similar to the constitution we have right now in Chile, but has many features which are the consequence of the fact that the world is different today than before, but they are consistent, I think, with the free market economy. But polls suggest that about 50% of the people will reject the new draft, and only 35% of the people are approving the new draft as of now. In the short run, I think we are in a win-win case, because if the new constitution is approved, it's a good constitution, we can live with it, it's very much free market oriented and so on. But if they reject the constitution, we go back to the old constitution, which is also free market. So in the short run, we are win-win. Now, I think that if the new proposal is approved, the left will have much less of an argument to try to change that constitution. Whereas if we go back to what they call the Pinochet constitution, the left will have a lot of arguments saying, well, we don't like that, we have to change it. And so we will continue with this constitutional process. But I repeat, in the short run, it's a win-win case, I think.
Thank you, Rao. And now, Alex, you have a slide load.
If someone can help me just put it. But basically, the beginning of the slide, I basically summarize some of the key points that Dr. Jordan made in a speech at the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, explaining what that Hayekian infrastructure is. So before you help me, someone?
Yes.
No, I want to start with, Jerry started with one of the parables, and the last book that Action Institute published here in Brazil is a Portuguese translation of economics of the parable by Father Robert. And I was reading the book Roads to Sound Money that I co-edited with Judy Shelton and in 2012. And Jerry started there with a quote of Father Sirico. There you wrote, "There were no restrictions remaining on the power of governments to finance unlimited debt. None of this was true under a gold stand." You know, sound money has been an agenda to restrain governments' arbitrary behavior. The other thing that Jerry mentioned was the topic of the Constitution. Last year I wrote a paper for a book in honor of Jesus Huerta de Soto. It was an analysis of Montpellier in 1980. And Milton Friedman was supposed to spoke at the last session, and he was going to speak of the last chapter of Free to Choose, where he says we need a constitutional restraint. You know, and it was very fascinating because I thought I was going to be expelled from the society because Milton said, "Look, I know that I wrote this, but I really don't believe it because Jerry said, you know, Argentina has a better constitution, and if people stop believing in it, it was not applied." But what I want to speak is about the gold bugs. You know, oh my God! And I said, "Look, I said this is an academic meeting. If you call us gold bugs, we can call you paper worm." You know, so and then I go boom, boom. But no, he became a very close friend and mentor. So I admire Milton. So let's go to the, let's see if I can make this move. So basically this is what Dr. Jordan means by the Hayekian infrastructure. Basically it's the view of equality before the law, no? And a key aspect of the Hayekian infrastructure is the monetary system. You know, so we need trust on the monetary system to be able to plan, you know, and to be able to enter into contracts. And we all believe that some money promotes prosperity, and there is a relationship with the fiscal sector. But as Dr. Jordan shows, it's not you can have fiscal imbalances and still have a stable monetary unit, or a more stable monetary unit. It also doesn't solve all the problems in the free society. I think one of my first newspaper articles in the Wall Street Journal of Argentina, after I visited Panama in the mid-80s with Sir Anthony Fisher, I wrote a piece called Monetary Stability and Corruption. People were hiding the corruption that was in Panama. You criticized Torrijos or Noriega and your throat was cut. So again, it didn't have inflation, but had huge of other problems in Panama. So again, obviously, the more fiscal imbalance and the less independent central bank, you know, the more potential you have for monetary manipulation. But what did I do for this session? I just went to the wonderful work of the Fraser Institute, and also I added the heritage rankings of the scores on sound money, is the name that is used in the category in the area 3 of Fraser Institute, and monetary freedom and heritage. So my a priori thing, when Jerry asked me to do this, I said, look, Latin America is completely diverse. You know, each of our countries is completely diverse. The northeast of Brazil is totally different. If we don't have the northeast here, Brazil will be the richest country in the world, and completely free market for the talent of the universities, the managers. So look what happened. And then I said, I compared with our other mentor, Kayak, you know, who wrote, in the worst time of inflation, he wrote this book, The Denationalization of Money, and in the second edition of that book, that you can find online, he had statistics of the previous 25 years in the world. So the column on the right shows the declining purchasing power. And look, it has nothing to do with genes, with Roman Catholicism or anything, or culture. You know, the top 3 countries in sound money, in a way, measured by loss in purchasing power, were Panama, Guatemala, and Venezuela, beating, you know, the United States and Switzerland. So, and then let's look Argentina, okay, always in the bottom. But look Uruguay and Chile. So some countries can perform. It's a matter of choice, to reform or not to reform the economies. Look at in the work of Fraser and the heritage, they have pretty strong correlation, and only 2 countries really have completely irresponsible monetary policy, which are Argentina and Venezuela. If you follow the debates in Argentina, again, Javier Milei has repeated, and Emilio Campo, a great banker, and Nicolas Kaczynowski, who developed the dollarization and closing the central bank plan, they said that's not negotiable. I do not know if they will be able to do it. I hope they do it, but this is an existential threat to the crony capitalist or the favoritism class, again, that idea, Matt, when you were speaking, the thing I said most is more of philosophy, and the concept of distributive justice has nothing to do with state redistribution. The idea of favoritism was strongly condemned as a violation of distributive justice, so it's a good idea to do that. But again, Argentina I think, this shows you why it's irredeemable. That is, they don't close the central bank for more than 3/4 of a century, abusing, the monetary authorities of the government. That will continue. But I think I just can't leave it there from the point of view that this is an area where economists perhaps deserve some credit. I think Mike Walker and you guys know better. The 2 areas that improved the most since you were doing the Economic Freedom Index are free trade and monetary freedom. So we have to recognize, let's go a little bit of Argentina, why things happen, why this happen. The founding father of our constitution, Juan Bautista Alvarez, was a great lawyer, a mixture of Jefferson and Madison. And basically he said, look, instead of copying the law of the Englishman, you have to copy the morals of the English. It's useless just to copy the law. Not only he wrote the Constitution, he wrote a 300-page manual of how to interpret the Constitution. Because he realized that the regulations that you use to interpret the Constitution, that was very short, can completely violate the constitutional principle. But to no avail. When ideas changed, Argentina went down the hill. Now, again, I said there's nothing Catholic in the issue. Juan Bautista Alvarez was a Catholic, but there was alternation of power in Argentina. His enemy, his nemesis, was Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, a president who was leading Freemason in Argentina. Argentina was 10 times more Catholic than what it is today. Now, finishing with this, the model that I used to explain why things happen and analyze a society or a region, things happen for 4 things: ideas, incentives, leadership, it's ideas without action and just ideas, and then providence or luck. We work in the 3, I also work in the 4th by training, but on the role of incentives, part of the incentives, I use the school of, I don't like public choice, the term, it's too good of a word for another thing. I call it the theory of bureaucratic decision making. And the incentives that exist in bureaucrats who are in trade and in money are much better than the incentives that exist in other areas of government. No one becomes a great, invited to, you were the central bank champion because your country depreciated the most. There are international incentives, and they basically, a lot of them changed after post-Walter in the United States and Margaret Thatcher, and after the euro. Say whatever you want of the euro, but the monetary policy has been much more stable, and the countries that adopt the euro get very high scores in the Fraser Institute. So there are incentives in many of the central banks in the world to behave more or less responsibly. Almost all my professors at Catholic University in Argentina went to the top school and repeating all the stupidity that people were saying at MIT or Harvard. So economists have an influence, but in many countries they are overridden by this crony capitalist class. Again, capitalism is the means of production that comes of the private sector, correct? There's nothing in the definition, on that definition, that prevents owners of the means of production colluding with the state. You know, so we can get offended if they use capitalism and they put a negative, pejorative adjective before it, but for Mises spoke about state capitalism, you know, and I prefer to speak about the free economy and avoid as much as I can capitalism. And again, part of the reason when I try to see why this happened, I think it's populism is the perfect breeding ground for populism is popular democracy and understood majority rule, they can do whatever, we use that as a kind of Rousseauian democracy, implemented in countries with completely heterogeneous population, where there's no similarity. You know, if you go to Peru, it's not only Brazil, no. Cusco is one thing, Arequipa is another. The Amazon, there's no government in the Amazon, in Quito. Brazil, Argentina. So when you implement popular democracy in these types of society with very little in common, it's bringing ground for sometimes comes Peron, and we have been stuck 80 years with Peronism, with 80% of the population living in that country. Or with Chavez, Venezuela had a completely transversal political parties. They had the rich, the middle class, and the poor in all the party. But it's very easy for an evil person to use that structure that something was created for good. The Argentinian central bank was created and pushed by Serotto Niemeyer. The British created the Argentinian intervention state. But then it only took one guy who decided, I'm going to use it for political purpose, you know, like Juan Domingo Perón. And for one reason or another, the mixture of these factors in some countries is so negative that I think can only change through radical solutions like the one that's being proposed today in Argentina, but hopefully it will happen. But if not, we're working in ideas. So thank you, Fraser Institute, for providing us all these great tools to analyze the economy.
Thank you, Alex. I was reminded of the flaws of the problem for creating institutional rules to govern society. Ronald Reagan, as governor before and then during the period leading up to being elected president, was a strong advocate of a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And then shortly after becoming president, he had to oppose and threaten to veto a proposal coming from the Congress because a very left of center Fred Owen insult, but he was a journalist before he became a congressman and senator. Paul Simon had written a draft of Constitution with 58 sponsors that put off limits to any kind of restraint on spending, such things as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. And what was left was the only way that the implementing legislation could achieve a balanced budget was a tax increase and a defense cut. That was the only thing that was left for the legislation. So the president had to threaten to veto a balanced budget amendment of the Constitution simply because the rules surrounding it were interfered with the objective. Hugo, it's your turn.
Hello. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing remarks. Also, thank you for using the parable from Luke. I am honored to hear you use it to essentially say something that I've always believed, that if a flower is not blooming, you change the environment, not the flower. You change the environment in which the flower grows, not the flower itself. Now, it just happened to be that I was coming out of Mass and they were referring to that parable, and it occurred to me and I shared it with you. I'm so glad that you used it. I love it. So I am Hugo Montesinos. I am originally from Venezuela, born and raised. Please excuse my English. I would say as Hector Lavoe would say. Hector Lavoe is a famous salsa singer. He would say, excuse my English is not very good looking. So, so bear with me. And also I am originally an engineer, turned into economist. So I am also a sinner in the sin of being too mathy and too much towards the models. And so I don't know how well I'm going to be able to articulate the ideas, and especially in a topic of which I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer of why the Hayekian infrastructure has not taken roots. But having said that, I'm going to talk a little bit about culture and institutions with a little bit of the perspective of a Venezuelan. So let me start by saying that Venezuela, from 1920 to 1958, and I wish I could project the numbers, but that's fine. Bear with me in the picture. No, it's not. It's not. That's fine. So from 1920 to 1958, we were an economic miracle, according to the data from Robert Barro, and Xavier Salay Martin. And the literature of economic growth in general puts Venezuela as an economic miracle from 1920 to actually, even Asdrúbal Baptista, a famous professor from Venezuela, in the Bases Cuantitativas de la Economía Venezolana, those numbers put Venezuela as an economic miracle by growing at an annual rate higher than 5% from 1920 to 1958. We were from being 15% of the GDP of the United States, less than 15%, to being 48% of the GDP of the United States in 1958. From 1958 or 1960 to 1998, let's say the 40 years after that, according to the literature of economic growth, we were an economic disaster. And that's because our annual average growth rate of per capita GDP was negative. And I have redone the calculation with new data sets, with Madison data set, with Penmore table, and I got positive zero, not statistically different from zero. Some data sets give you negative, not statistically different from zero. But in essence, we didn't grow in real terms, in a world that was growing. Now, not only that, I've listened to many economists in Venezuela, including Miguel Rodriguez, who was instrumental in some policies in Venezuela. And they actually praised some of the policies in the 60s and the 70s. And when you look at the data, Venezuela continued growing in the 60s and the 70s. Now, when you look how Venezuela was growing relative to the frontier, let's say, relative to the United States, as the graph you were saying, showing growth, relative to other countries, well, Venezuela really started declining. And why was that? Actually, yeah, we actually have democracy now. And by the way, as a Venezuelan, it hurts me, it pains me that my family participated in that. My grandfather, Hugo Montesinos Castillo, Hugo Rafael Montesinos Castillo, participated in the coup d'etat that was a leader in the coup d'etat against Marcos Pérez Jiménez. And my dad always tells me the story that in the New Year's Eve of 1957, my grandfather came and said, everybody go to sleep, we're not celebrating New Year's Eve. Why? Because he was conspiring with the people and the tanks and the arms to go to Caracas to take over the power, and he was also a speaker, so he actually, and a media person, so he put the radio stations and television stations in chain, and he was speaking, saying, Venezuelans, get out to the street. This government is already down. He was captured, tortured, very bad type of tortures, but he survived, and a couple of weeks afterward, 3 weeks, January 23rd, 1958, government of Venezuela fell, Marcos Pérez Jiménez flew, and we started a new democracy. Now, we changed a brutal, ruthless dictatorship for a democracy. And my grandfather fought against that dictatorship. But what he didn't know is that the democracy that would come would destroy the economic freedoms that we had in the previous decades. Because even though we didn't have economic freedom, we didn't have political freedom, we had economic freedom. The means of production were private, and we gave concessions to the oil industries. And the government really didn't interfere with the economy. It just interfered with whoever was against them, and they would put them in jail, and they would torture them and do horrific things. But the economy was by and large following the markets and the Hayekian infrastructure of a market economy, and we grew significantly. Now, we tend to confuse political freedom with economic freedom. What happens after that is that after 1958, we started with a set of political reforms, for example, the agrarian reform, where we took away the property titles from the agricultors, and instead we gave them titles to use temporarily the land. And what's most important to me, in the 70s, starting in 1975, we nationalized the steel industry. And then in 1976, we nationalized the oil industry. So we nationalized the commanding heights of the economy. As a result of that, you can imagine we also nationalized the communication system. The CanTV became national. It didn't work for a while, so we had to make it private again. When we made it private, it became to work again until Chavez later nationalized it. But the point being that we became socialists in that decade under democracy. With the democracy came socialism. And the list of people who were, what's the word for this? Adulando. Praising Fidel Castro in the media, in the communication, in the enterprises. It's just pretty much most of the Venezuelan elites were praising Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union as well. Now, let me switch a little bit into culture, but to do that, I mean, institutions as Douglas North defined them, are the rules of the game, or more formally, humanly devised constraints that shape human behavior. And within that definition for institutions in general, I would define also inclusive economic institutions as those that maximize voluntary transactions. And those are consistent with the institutions that we measure with the Economic Freedom of the World Index, when we measure freedom to enter and compete in markets, voluntary exchange, and protection of property and life from aggression from others. Now, the institutions in vain, or isolated in and of itself, don't mean much. They are not in a vacuum. They are in context. And that context is culture. Now, it is so subtle. It's much more than informal institutions, as somebody said, some people have said. And to that degree, I'm actually going to cite Choi and Storr, that they have a paper about the culture of rent-seeking. And they argue that this is much more than just informal institutions. It's just a context that sometimes we take for granted. And actually, let me read the definition of a culture of rent-seeking: a perception shared by members of a society that having influence over political allocations is an important and potentially preferable source of private benefit than other avenues in pursuing economic gain. They actually also frame this in a framework, in a Weberian approach, a Weberian framework, with different spirits hanging on your head in terms of what works and what doesn't, in terms of what's legitimate to do and what is not legitimate to do. Now, there are many different types of culture. A culture of rent-seeking, I think it matters. A culture of, by the way, don't know which is the best term, but I like the favoritism that you brought about. Matt, a professor of mine, Randy Holcomb, would use a broad term called political capitalism instead of crony capitalism, but to a degree also mercantilism that goes really alludes to the feudal economic system where people will try to collect gold, but for that you try to restrict trade, and the idea that wealth is fixed, and as opposed to something that can grow because of innovation, or state capitalism. All of those terms, all referring to the same enemy that essentially prevents competition, hinders competition. So I would say that the biggest two enemies of inclusive economic institutions are, well, all of these terms of political capitalism in that broad umbrella and socialism/communism. And then having those two things, the interaction between the two. The interaction, in the case of Venezuela, well, we have that interaction in place, and it's really, really damaging that you see these entrepreneurs, empresarios, actually, that really don't want to compete. And something I want to add is that these people are venerated by the society. Why? Because they make a lot of money, and what do they do with that money? They actually, some of that they invested in Venezuela. They do schools, they do political, they do sporting events, and people love them. People love them. So that over time it becomes a culture where you think it's legitimate that these people actually make their money that way without competition, and people defend them. They need to do this in order for us to survive. We need to protect the local industry. And have you heard that? Everywhere, pretty much. Now, in terms of, so that's in terms of political capitalism. In terms of the other monster, the other evil, communism and socialism, well, is dead, right? Marxism is dead. Why? The fall of communism shows that that's the case. Cuba, North Korea, no country that has embraced Marxism, Engelsism, communism, socialism has prospered. Well, no, it's not dead. It's kind of dead in the economic sense, but it's not dead in the cultural sense. So remember what they actually mean. They actually really mean not so much anything about the economy. It's really a clash of classes. The oppressor versus the oppressed. The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. You versus me. It's a dividing culture. And when I discuss this with my students, I ask them to identify, what do you identify with? Are you a bourgeoisie or are you a proletariat? What do you identify with? And they're like, oh, wow. Yeah, I've never thought it that way. Those two categories are not very representative. But when you're talking about, when you're not thinking about it, it's very easy to say, yeah, let's blame someone else. Therefore, let's divide and have an oppressor and an oppressed. Well, that's what they tried to do with the economy. It didn't work. But think about it, we were talking about how many genders we have. Now, if you don't think that one person who transitioned from one gender to another is a they, them, then you're oppressing them. You're against them. You're the oppressor. You become the standard, the status quo who's oppressing those who want to change. So they're trying to, effectively are the same ideas of an oppressor versus an oppressed. And they're trying to instill those ideas through other aspects of culture that are not necessarily the economics one. Now, this is very dangerous because it has everlasting consequences. Now, culture, there are many different cultures, and some of them are more malleable than others. Some of them change less or faster than others, are more sticky than others. Some of them not. One of the ones that changes very, very slowly is language. And I was talking with Matt, the effect of language on the economy, and it has to do because out of the many dimensions of culture, the one that has been associated with economic growth and prosperity, for the most part, is individualism, collectivism dimension. And when you look at the language, and it was developed over millennia, even not just the history, but also the prehistory, prehistoric. Before writing, you're already speaking. And how that language evolved has to do with the interaction of tribes talking to each other, trading to each other, among themselves and others, exploiting their diverse talents. And so it's a combination of history, path, culture itself, geography, that, in my opinion, drives that culture, and as a result, it drives the institution, the inclusive economic institution. Now, when it comes to language, let me give you an example of something. In Spanish, if I want to say, yo estoy hablando, I do not need to say yo. I can just say, estoy hablando. The same in Portuguese. I don't need to say, eu estou falando. I can say, estou falando. And that's perfectly grammatically correct. In English, I cannot say the same thing without the I. I need to say, I am speaking. Have you thought about that? How the personal pronoun needs to be present in English in order for you to say a grammatically correct sentence. So inherently, the individualism there is always present. But not only that, once you go into written language, you not only have to have the personal pronoun I, you need to capitalize it. So you capitalize the word God, and you capitalize the word I, and so far we know English is the only language that has such a characteristic that makes, obviously, people who speak the language naturally more individualistic. They think about themselves, and my students actually, for the most part, they leave home to pursue their careers at a different place as opposed to their families. They stay with their families, and they want to be the best, as opposed to, yeah, no, let's just have something and conform with society. That promotes a culture of independence, of autonomy, of pursuing the self-individual success, as opposed to conformity, obedience, and interdependence instead of independence. Now, when we look at individualism and economic institutions, and I hope I end with that with this soon. And I have a graph here, but a picture in my mind. In the x-axis, have individualism going from 0 to 100, and this is individualism from Hofstede dimension. And on the y-axis, I have the average economic freedom from 1985 to 2015 in 5-year increments, but that's just the average. So then, picture the average economic freedom, which is like 4 point something, I believe, and the average individualism, which is about 40 or so. I don't remember the exact numbers, but in the first quadrant, high economic freedom, high individualism, well, are the countries that not only grow faster, but also at the very top are the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and highly individualistic countries. Also, there are the, believe it or not, Sweden and Denmark. In the third quadrant are the countries that have low economic freedom and collectivism. Now, I want to remark two things. One, all Latin American countries are not in the right. And by this, I say not in the right, I say all but one, Argentina, are in the left of culture. So all Latin American countries are collectivistic from the hosted measure of culture. And Argentina is slightly to the right of the average, but not statistically significant. So it's essentially at the average collectivism. Now, some of them have grown a little faster than others, depending on the period. And some of them have had more economic freedom or less economic freedom, depending on the period. Venezuela, well, we didn't measure economic freedom back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, but back then we had much more liberalization, market liberalization. Now, we went back. Now the question will be, to what extent that has to do, in a great extent or lesser extent, to the culture, to the individualistic culture that promotes that instability. You have economic freedom, but then you lose it, then you may have it, but then you lose it. You have resistance. That my worker was telling me, at the end of the day, is the people who are going to pursue these reforms or not. So, let me just finish with two remarks super quickly. One has to do with the Estonia single revolution. I believe that if we embrace and understand that the culture matters for embracing successful reforms, and we take examples like the single revolution of Estonia, we can promote reforms that are going to be more widely accepted in the population. While I was reading this paper by Choi and Storr, it really opened my mind about what culture really means. And I picture, I'm going to give a sporting analogy. I picture Pelé and Neymar watching a World Cup with their families, and how excited they were watching the World Cup and watching Brazil participate in the World Cup in different ages, of course. Neymar would have seen Romario and Ronaldo at USA '94. Well, maybe even he's younger than that. Pelé, a different Brazil. But he would be like so excited to see his family playing, watching at the television, watching the soccer match, that would influence his life, not only in the field, but off the field. Off the field, he's going to be thinking about the soccer. Off the field, he's going to be thinking about what he wants to be the best at soccer, because that is something he's thinking all the time. In contrast, in Venezuela, Miguel Cabrera was never really watching soccer. He was playing chapita. And chapita is a game that we play, and it works like this. With the lid of the beer bottle that their dad is drinking is the ball. And the stick of a sweeping broom is the bat. And that stick is really thin, and this lid is really small, and also when you throw it across the street, it goes in a curve. So you play for hours and hours and hours a day that game, you get an amazing hitter. And out of a population of, right now, 30 million, you have so many big leaguers in baseball. It's difficult to have, for us, people like Neymar. Yeah, we still have Salomon Rondon, Juan Arango, Joseph Martinez. They're good soccer players, but at that level it's difficult. I mean, if Uruguay and Brazil, they live and breathe soccer. Now, I hope this kind of let us thinking about how we live and breathe the culture that we as individuals can prosper, can succeed, and that we think about how I'm going to create an enterprise that's going to be for me and my family, and that's honorable, as opposed to how do I think about what kind of political connections who do I need to talk to become prosperous? The know who as opposed to the know how. So that, on that end, and let me just say one more final remark about inequality, and that's really not to do too much about my presentation, but I believe also it affects culture, thinking it from the perspective of the culture of inequality. Do we think as inequality as a good thing, as Vlad was discussing earlier in his presentation, or do we think about inequality as a bad thing? And Fred, you were discussing the remarks from Bob about how inequality promotes stability. I would argue that there are two kinds of inequality. Two kinds. The good one and the bad one. Now, what are those? The good one is the result of innovation, productivity, competition, and growth. Say the type of inequality that comes from Steve Jobs creating the iPad and the iPhone, and Elon Musk doing things. The bad one would be the one that comes as a result of political connection, plunder, corruption, and steal. If that's the type of inequality that you're exposed to, if that's what you see, that the way to get richer is to be through political connections, through contacts, through know-who, as opposed to through know-how, then inequality is naturally going to be a bad thing in your culture. But if the inequality you see is that one that comes out of innovation, productivity, creation, creativity, and therefore the natural reward that the society gives you out of that, I don't think people are going to necessarily think of inequality in a bad way. Nobody really think of, yeah, no, it's kind of like unfair that Messi earns this much, unfair that Neymar earns this much, because we know they're talented and they're doing amazing things. So, well, having that remark about the two kinds of inequalities and how that affects culture, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. It actually suggests a number of interesting hypotheses, some of which could actually be measured, Mike, if we figure out how to do it. Next we have Roberta.
You hear me? First of all, thanks so much, Jerry and Rod, for letting me join this panel. It's very inspiring, lots of food for thought, so I appreciate it. Answering the question of why Brazil has not taken the road of a Hayekian infrastructure of a market economy is not an easy task at all, especially if I have very few minutes. My hunch is that any effort to tackle these complex issues requires to take the history of Brazilian institutions seriously. My main conjecture is that our extractive institutions have evolved in a way that converged on an economic system called, crony capitalism, that is built on a symbiotic relationship between big government and interest groups to favor their own goals through rent-seeking activities. The engine of rent-seeking is discretionary power of public officials that are entitled to make the interventions. Understanding these troubled issues take us back to the 16th century, when Brazil, as a colony of the Portuguese Empire, could not choose its own institutional framework. Brazilian institutions in colonial times were responsible to the constraints mercantilism put on voluntary exchanges, freedom to trade, freedom to compete, freedom to have endorsable basic property rights. Unfortunately, there was slavery, and people were not treated the same way under the law. Such hostile institutional settings partly explain why a norm of the type, if you want to survive as an individual or a business, invest time in personal interaction and collaboration with those who are in power, was selected by cultural evolution and became part of our belief system, culture, and institutions. In the 19th century, as an independent nation from Portugal, Brazil already reviewed moments of economic growth due to exports of primary goods, something natural, of course, due to its initial endowments and comparative advantages. And the positive outcomes allowed for already spontaneous industrialization, banking, among other urban economic service provided by the private sector. Yet, the belief system favoring crony relations and rent-seeking survived. The same holds to the 20th century, when Vargas, our Perón, conquered power and became a dictator. From 1930 to 1945, many institutions, regulatory agencies, and organizations were redesigned to endorse his debatable view of economic development as a national project, undertaken by a strong government that would be the father of the poor people. The propaganda was that Brazil, under development, resulted from its position in the international trade that was regarded as a zero-sum game. The foregoing misleading ideas became more and more appealing in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And this is partly due to the influence of the Economic Commission for Latin America, CEPAL, that had lots of influences in universities and lots of appeal to populist policymakers. To them, an exporter of agricultural goods like Brazil would have a commercial policy doomed to failure and poverty. The solution would be then to promote a national developmentalist project in which big government would be responsible for long-term funding of private as well as public investments, make production and allocation decisions, control prices, allocate resources, provide subsidies to industrial sectors that would put the country closer to the technological frontier and free from the very unfair international competition. To me, the Brazilian choice of an institutional framework to put import substitution model into action gave rise to an increasingly complex trajectory of interventionism with lots of rooms for tax breaks, capital and price controls, trade barriers, subsidies that in turn institutionalized rent-seeking and gave extra room for new mistaken stages of interventionism. Such trend persisted after Brazil and its Brazilian redemocratization, in the 80s, and even extended economic privileges to other groups after the 1998 Constitution, the Constituição Cidadã, the Citizens' Constitution, in response to that increasingly complex dynamics of interventionism, always accompanied with fiscal crisis. Some presidents, and we can cite some names, Cardoso, Temer, Bolsonaro, in a sense, they all invested some energy, but not enough, to my humble opinion, on institutional reforms that could put Brazil a bit closer, Jerry, to a Hayekian economic infrastructure. They decided to play safe and to stay in power, and went on playing the game of rent-seeking and crony capitalism. We now have a new government, you might all know, that promised some institutional reforms. Brazil is trying to approve a new tax reform. The initial idea was to simplify our chaotic tax structure with the introduction with a VAT system. All that seems, to me, a field experiment for us to test the robustness of rent-seeking and crony capitalism institutions. Until a few days ago, the Senate is negotiating lots of tax exemptions, special interests, that are given to specific group categories like physicians and lawyers, sectors like travel agencies, giving zero tax to some basic food items that were not even specified, extra federal transfers to a fund for regional development, tax privileges to automobile sector, and lots of other inefficient businesses like the Amazonian Free Trade Area called Zona Franca de Manaus, who accommodates mainly companies that are maquiladoras, that only survive due to tax benefits. People, after all, this not so optimistic interpretation of why we are very far from the Hayekian infrastructure, what can we all do to contribute to a better scenario in the future for economic freedom? My suggestion is education, education, education. Since it is a promising way to contribute, it may take a while, but it's worth it. We have to change the belief system, and because Brazil needs a better belief system and better economic institution. Let's do it. It's important. It's time not to give up informing people about the prohibitive economic as well as social cost of crony capitalism and extremely positive consequences of economic freedom for real people's wealth, health, and happiness. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Roberta. Brazil has been a puzzle to me since 50 years or so, the first time I came to Brazil. Andrew Ferguson, who preceded Adam Smith and David Hume, had argued that it's not by human design, but our human actions by which prosperity. And I've always wondered why the acceptance of human design come on high seemed to be especially strong in Brazil, was always my impression. And allowing things to emerge spontaneously as a result of human action simply was not a concept widely accepted. And your presentation still leaves me with wondering about these, like, maybe it's these cultural issues that we've started talking about. And so our next presentation is Jorge from Bolivia.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for the invitation to speak today. Last night, in the enthusiasm of the conversation, Michael asked me if I knew personally Hayek. It wouldn't be possible, but having read so much about what he has written, I think I can say I know him a little. So I would say the Austrian tradition and its commitment to methodological individualism, what economists would say microeconomics, I think it's very important in the Hayekian infrastructure. This idea that each person can and should take its own decision, and in that way society coordinates better the decisions that collectively they are making. It's central to this Hayekian infrastructure. And in a way, this is common sense. I believe that greatly part of Millei's success is due to that. He's telling something that is very common sense. You are your own agent. You have the responsibility of your own life. But then, while Hayek was living economics went to speak about aggregates, not about persons. And probably to please other methodological theories or empirist and rationalist methodologies from the time. And as you know, this idea of the Methodenstreit was always essential to the Austrian tradition, with Karl Menger too, and the German school. And Mises and Hayek's ostracism has a lot to do with this commitment to the marginal and the individual methodological individualism. Because I think one has to be committed to the truth one has discovered. They weren't just stubborn. They knew that the Austrian method works better, explains reality better, so they had to stay committed to that. And Hayek, for example, Hayek goes so far as to say that Mises was the only person who understood what was happening in post-World War I in Europe, why inflation was so rampant. So why, or I would say too, in 1922 he explained why socialism wouldn't work. It couldn't work. Much years before we all saw their failure in 1991. So why hasn't the Hayekian or the Austrian infrastructure taken root? I would say yet, because I'm hopeful it will, because it's methodologically stronger. My ideas are, in a way, making so to say a self criticism as an Austrian, probably because some of the text or from Mises or Hayek sometimes have a bitter language because they realize that they aren't being heard. So sometimes you can see they are bitter about them. And with a bitter attitude and a bitter language, you can't have a friendly dialogue with other people. So I would say that kind of a partial part of that. Because being right doesn't mean that you don't have the necessity to hear the other. Mises and Hayek were totally convinced that they were right, but probably they should have heard other positions more, I think. Coming from Bolivia, I would say that happens also in other parts, but cultural and intellectual elites don't understand their own reality because they are using wrong theories. So they read Marx, to say simply, and they try to adapt that to our own realities. Not realizing not only that the theory is wrong and that thus couldn't explain reality good, but they try to force things. So they invent and add many ad hoc theories, so to say, to make their own ideas fit with reality. And again, I go to this idea of common sense and common knowledge. If, as Hayek says, successful historical processes come from bottom-up phenomena, bottom-up institutions, spontaneous orders, we, I would argue, have to look more careful to our own realities. Being confident in the method, in the Austrian method in this way, that puts the person in the center. And please notice I'm saying person, not individual. If you have questions about that, you can ask me later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. This panel has really brought forth a lot of interesting ideas about the situation throughout in the other countries in Latin America that we were not able to talk about. I'm going to open it up for a little bit of discussion as long as Fred doesn't bring down the gavel and say that we must stop. I want to first ask a question for Hugo. At the beginning of your remarks, you suggested an alternative hypothesis from one that I had long held or wondered about. The first ambassador for the United Nations for Ronald Reagan was Jean Kirkpatrick. She drew a distinction between a totalitarian regime and an authoritarian regime. Milton Friedman argued that authoritarian regimes where you had did not have political freedoms but you had economic freedoms would naturally evolve into one where you had personal freedoms because and eventually get away from authoritarian regime to democracy. And you suggested an alternative that democracy through process of nationalization of industries and so on could evolve from authoritarian through democracy to totalitarian. It's a hypothesis, it's an evolutionary experience. Would you describe that as an alternative to what Jean Kirkpatrick and Milton Friedman suggested?
Hello. Yeah. No, I wouldn't really describe it too much as an alternative, but as an example of what they were suggesting to a degree. So essentially they would suggest that, and I would agree, Milton Friedman would say, and Hayek as well, that economic freedom is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, for political freedom. Which means that, well, you can have political freedom with economic freedom, but you cannot have political freedom without economic freedom. Does that make sense? So it's a necessary condition for political freedom, but it's not a sufficient condition for economic freedom. Another way to say that is that you need more than just economic freedom to achieve political freedom. Now, what anecdotally I said is that in Venezuela, we have tyrannical, authoritarian regimes, and that led to democracy. Under the democracy, we eroded the economic freedom. So we had political freedoms, but not economic freedoms. And as a result of the erosion of the economic freedom, because it is a necessary condition but not a sufficient condition, if you don't have it, that's going to lead to totalitarian regimes, and that's what led to Chavez. What I would hope is that if you have enough economic freedom, that will provide incentives for totalitarian regimes, such as, let's say, China, for example. If they open more their markets, that would provide incentives for a change in the political system. Now, that relationship is weak, in my opinion. What's strong is if you don't have economic freedom, then you won't have political freedom.
Well, yeah, I think that these are things that we can, Fred, I think, is going to try and get me to stop, but that we may be able to discuss some more tests. But at one point, Mike Walker had suggested to me that there was an alternative to just talking narrow, I would say somewhat narrowly, economic freedom, talk about human freedom. And I think it was his sister that suggested to him the way to approach the issue was you could tell about human freedom in a society by the role of women. And Mike, am I getting that more or less correct as far as, but it's a broader concept, and it's an interesting hypothesis that human freedom is related to not just some of the issues we've been talking about, but such a thing that we don't actually measure usually. What's the role of women in society, and how much we have Matt, I think you wanted to remark.
Just a real quick point is on that question of the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. Bob Lawson does a paper with J.R. Clark in which they test the hypothesis. So the paper is called "Examining the Hayek-Friedman Hypothesis on Economic and Political Freedom." Remember, the claim is not it's possible to have a society without political freedom that is still economically free.
I see that.
Yes, exactly. But it is very difficult to have a society that has political freedom without economic freedom, and they basically find empirically that's exactly.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you for articulating it better.
Fred?
Just a point of procedure. Vlad and I just caucused, and how about 12:30 is a hard deadline?
Okay, so we still have close to 15 minutes. I want to go back to Roberta and maybe some of Vlad and others from Brazil. Am I wrong about suggesting that the propensity to favor human design rather than human action is very strong in Brazil, maybe compared to others? Robert?
Jerry, I have no idea if I can really do a fair comparison with other countries, but I'm inclined to agree with you that in Brazil, all this idea, this huge propensity for designing, is part of our culture. I think history explains institutions in colonial times were super hostile, okay? And I really believe in cultural evolution. So this small group that I said, okay, to you guys, that for you to survive as an individual, you need to be with somebody that is in power. And people start believing that it is the way it goes. And this is very easy for populists and for people to, like Vargas, among very other populists here in Brazil, including the current president, I dare to say, that they believe that they are the designers, and in Brazil in particular, there is a very long-standing tradition. I think it's part of our culture, really. I cannot think of something alternative.
But
Excuse
is it
me.
a pervasive acceptance of top-down?
I think it's top-down. I really think it's top-down.
And acceptance at the
Yeah, yeah.
throughout the society.
Yeah, I think.
Vlad, do you want to comment to it?
Oh yes, sorry. Finish.
No, Vlad, really, be my guest, really.
I think what's going on, part of our inequality is the idea of top-down is that in the top, the people that has best connections, best knowledge and education. So I am in the bottom, I will accept this. Part of the answer, that's why I accept the top-down decisions. I think the second part of the answer, in our, I would say not for the whole period, but since 1930s in Brazil, the idea that came from the Economic Commission, headquartered in Chile, the Latin American Economic Commission, the idea that with planning you can go further steps toward to development by industrialization. So the idea that have someone that study planning, economic planning, and decide what is technically what should be the best. So this idea is very strong until nowadays in the academia. So if you study economics in Brazil, you probably you have more than a half of the discussion with economic policy towards planning or towards designing. And so the basic, the ideal economist is a guy who is going to be on the top, managing the system and planning. So this is so strong, and other social sciences also in our Latin America, in Brazil particularly, with this idea of planning a system to go further in development. So Argentina has Perón, and we have Vargas is equivalent in Brazil, and this I think it was a trap for both countries, and for us nowadays, just to have an idea, the only classical liberal think tank in Brazil is ours, with a huge country with 220 million people, several universities, just one. And we face a lot of challenges because what we are trying to say that economic freedom matters. So why you are the only guy that's saying that economic freedom matters? So this is, I think, it's part of the culture, but the culture rooted in this period from 30s, not 30s only in Brazil, 30s in the whole world that took us to the Second World War. The idea of central planning and big governments and technical decision from the bureaucrats. Okay, this is my point.
Roberta, you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add something. I think it's really something ingrained in our culture, in our system of values, okay? That there is someone to help us. Okay. I remember when you we exchanged some emails, and you mentioned the fatal conceit of Hayek. Okay. I'm not proud. To me, it's overwhelming to say that in Brazil, okay, many of us, when we go to the university, okay, many of us from middle class, we believe that okay, we will use scientific knowledge, economic knowledge, to design society. Okay. So many people count on us, and we start believing, and we become so fucking arrogant. I'm sorry to put it like that, because this is really a big thing. And we forget that real knowledge is fragmented, is dispersed. And yesterday I was teaching my students Austrian economics, and they were really struck when I said to them that we are all ignorant. We go to the market to figure things out, to recalibrate on an ongoing basis our plans. And that's why we need freedom. That's how the human condition. But this system of belief is not part of Brazil, Jerry. So we are not gardeners. Economists here are not gardeners. They are social engineers. And they say like this very proudly. And against this arrogance, I think it will be a long way. And to me, the antidote, as I said, is education.
Yeah, enormous challenge, to say the least. Portillo.
Well, about Brazil again. 7 years ago, the Workers' Party lost the election here in São Paulo. And they decided to do a pretty good research at the favelas to realize why they lost elections. And they went with the hypothesis that it was because of the churches, because of religion. And they actually found out that the people in the favelas, they didn't look the people hired them as the oppressors. They looked at them as equals because they saw they actually had the same issues with bureaucracy, with difficulty to be an entrepreneur. And they found out that the people there loved the church because it's actually an environment to improve the people's lives. And they took down that research from the website because it was not very in favor of them. But we realized that people at favelas, they really in favor of freedom. But nobody's there telling them that there's a whole system of ideas that support that. Because we don't have the media. Media here is very left-wing. So they are talking about the importance of more government, more spending, and more government support. We have a huge project that nobody in the media, the mainstream media, talked about it. We tried. And we even had people, journalists saying, I won't talk about that because it was from the previous government. It was a highly radical government. I won't talk about that. So we don't have the media, we don't have the universities, we don't have educations. The education system, for example, 2 days ago we had the national exam for high school, and we had like 5 or 6 questions based on Karl Marx, including questions saying that the agribusiness kills people. So in the country that like 1/3 of the GDP is about agriculture. It's actually the only thing that really works well. So, but they didn't realize at the time that was one small thing that was reaching the poor, but they did realize that with Bolsonaro election, that was the social networks. Because the poor had access to WhatsApp, to Facebook, to Twitter, and they saw online that there's another kind of ideas that can support them. And now what they started doing, to hunt down people using the Supreme Court against people saying in favor of free market ideas and in favor of more. Of course, we had some radicals there that were hunted down too, but they started to hunt down everybody. So now we have a problem with freedom of expression too, because of that. But we did have an opportunity there, and I think we still do, to use better the social networks to reach more people, especially the poor, and say, yes, there's a different kind of system here that supports you having more freedom to become richer and to get a better life.
Very, very interesting, I think. Courtney.
Thank you. Probably with a couple more minutes, I want to point this idea more why I use the term person and not individual, because it's not just semantics. Person is a philosophical concept that inherently, essentially, has the idea of relation. Individual, on the contrary, it's like an atom. That's why talking about personal freedom, I think it's important, because I am the son of my parents, the brother of my sister, the friend of my friends, the member of a community, of a church, of a football club. And I think it's very important for us in the classic liberal movement to show people that when we are speaking about freedom, we are not speaking about my selfish freedom. Selfishness is not a virtue. We must say that, I think. We must show that we are rooting for your success, because your success would mean the success of your family. And normal people, a normal man or woman, want to be successful not for her or himself, but for their family, for their friends. If I'm well off, I will invite my friends to a barbecue at my home. That's natural. And we are, I think, in the liberal movement saying that clearly enough, because when we speak about personal freedom or individual freedom, people tend to hear laissez-faire, egotistical people, selfish, you only want to be good for yourself, and that's where socialists grow stronger, because they say they want to take your rights, they want to take your benefits, they want to turn around the family. If we have that woke ideology, in Latin America, you don't want to have anything with modernity, because you see that as the modern day, what Europe or the US are exporting to us. So we tend to go back to tribalism and say we are happy, poor, but happy. And you, the Latin Americans, know that. I don't know why, and I will end with this, is we kind of have this strange sensation that, yeah, that's Latin America, we're poor, but we're happy. But we're happy because we have communities, we have families, friends, stronger than in Europe or the US.
Even though we're up against Vlad and the Fred deadline, I want to give Natalia a comment, because it's a view other than from within Latin America, I think would be interesting.
Thank you very much. Well, to me, it was a revelation a couple of years ago how similar the situation in my country is to that of Latin America. The same issues that we're facing, but to the point that, my country right now, we know a lot about the welfare state and not being able to afford it, and the supposed need to help out a lot of people in need, because we've always had issues with poverty, but right now we're mostly dealing with internally displaced people and a way to somehow help them out. So it's just an interesting contrast between state solutions and the free market ideas. So the state solution was essentially to put people in gymnasiums, in gyms at schools and universities where they spent months living there, and then kids came back to school to study, and then people had to get out somewhere. So that was the solution on the one hand. On the other hand, it came from the civil society, because fortunately we have a very powerful civil society in the country. So they, after the Kiev region was deoccupied, they started going to these little towns and villages that were kind of dying out, and they were researching what professionals they needed there. They created a database, and they looked through the database of internally displaced persons and started matching professionals with the needs in those local communities, and that's how they started covering those needs. And with the help of local communities looking for houses, apartments, any kinds of accommodations to bring those people in. And so I think that in our case, we were once again able to see that maybe not through only entrepreneurial ways, but just creating a free market of solutions and ideas, it will work, because it does work and it has the potential to be scaled and replicated if we learn from that experience.
Well, Hayek would be proud of that example of the uses of knowledge in society. That anything that lowers information and transactions costs and allows more, I would say individual, but maybe I need to think about the decision making, and maybe the spontaneity of human action is facilitated by improving the mechanisms, social media and others, for human knowledge, the uses of knowledge in our societies. I think I better call this to an end. Thank you very, very much for, I thought it was a panel that exceeded my hopes and expectations, and I want to thank all of you for this. Maybe we'll continue and approach on the time of others in the afternoon. Thank you.